Hello and welcome to the Krakauer podcast. I am your host, Maggie, and I will be discussing Chapter 7 of Into Thin Air. Krakauer opens the chapter by discussing how Everest summons dreamers. He argues that many of the climbers on his expedition have less experience than he does, and yet they are determined to conquer the greatest accomplishment that is climbing the largest mountain on Earth. Krakauer then talks about the 1947 expeditions and introduces Earl Denman. Earl Denman is a Canadian who has had very little climbing experience. Krakauer then discusses how Denman didn't have permission to enter Tibet, and yet he manages to make it across Tibet and up to 22,000 feet. Denman then encounters a storm which ultimately made him turn back. Krakauer then starts to talk about Maurice Wilson. He also doesn't have much climbing experience. Wilson attempted to climb the same route as Denman 13 years before him. Krakauer mentions that Wilson's reasons to get to the top were different than most climbers. Wilson wanted to summit Mount Everest to get publicity to spread his beliefs. Wilson believed that fasting and believing in God could solve all of the problems in the world. Wilson repeatedly tried to summit several times until eventually someone found his body. Krakauer talks about the disapproval and danger of an increasing number of amateur climbers attempting to summit Mount Everest. While waiting for the teammates, Krakauer meets Pete Schoing and Clev Schoing, who are famous Himalayan climbers. Schoing is most well known for his rescue during an unsuccessful attempt. Schoing was holding a rope, and on it was a man who was stricken with altitude sickness and four other climbers. One of the climbers slipped, and Schoing was able to hold all five of them on one rope. He is known for starting what is now known as belaying. Schoing was a member of Scott Fischer's team. Krakauer discusses how his team is not as great as Fischer's team, but not as weak as other teams. Krakauer then discusses how Taiwanese climbing expeditions are notorious for being untrained and careless. He then lists the examples of one Taiwanese climbing expedition on Mount McKinley. The expedition was led by the same guide as the guide of the expedition in 1996. Krakauer then discusses how the South African group is pretty careless and dangerous as well. Krakauer mentions that their guide Ian Woodall had been deceiving his group about what was going on. Krakauer said, quote, Woodall had no interest in the birth of a new South Africa. He took the dreams of an entire nation and utilized them for his own selfish purposes. End quote. What Krakauer meant by this is that Woodall was lying about his identity and trying to steal South African culture. Woodall, Woodall had his group believing that he was from South Africa, when in fact he was British. So what do you think of Chapter 7? Do you think that Ian Woodall was just about lying about his heritage, or do you think it was wrong? Where do you think the book will go next? I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Krakauer podcast.